I'm an eye, a mechanical eye. I, the machine, show you a world the way only I can see it. I free myself for today and forever from human immobility. I'm in constant movement. I approach and pull away from objects. I creep under them. I move alongside a running horse's mouth. I fall and rise with the falling and rising bodies. This is I, the machine, maneuvering the chaotic movements, recording one movement after another in the most complex combinations. Freed from the boundaries of time and space, I coordinate any and all points of the universe wherever I want them to be. My way leads towards the creation of a fresh perception of the world. Thus I explain in a new way the world unknown to you. Ziga Vertov, early 20th century.
Cameras are strange. On the surface, they seem quite normal, even very practical. In the Western world, it is becoming increasingly difficult to look around and not see a camera. They are in our phones, our computers, our public transportation, our places of work, and our places of play. Cameras are all around us, and their numbers are constantly increasing. What truly distinguishes a camera from an eye is that unlike an eye, a camera remembers. It is its purpose to capture and contain the visible to be viewed again and again. What you are watching are scenes from the documentary Man with a Movie Camera, created in 1929 by Russian filmmaker Ziga Vertov. The film demonstrates that anywhere a person may go, a camera may go. And what the camera sees, anyone may see. Sight and Sound magazine has declared Man with a Movie Camera to be the greatest documentary ever made. Ziga Vertov was more than a filmmaker. He was an important film theorist as well. His ideas on film are still widely influential today. This film begins with one of his most famous quotes. Vertov would frequently call the camera his second eye. I have been fascinated by Vertov and his work ever since I learned of him. Each time I watch Man with a Movie Camera, I am taken aback by how fresh it still seems. Vertov understood the camera in a way that few of his contemporaries did, and his ideas are still being learned today.
Our eyes see very little and very badly. So people dreamed up the microscope to let them see invisible phenomena. They invented the telescope. Now they have perfected the cine camera to penetrate more deeply into the visible world, to explore and record visual phenomena so that what is happening now, which will have to be taken account of in the future, is not forgotten. Ziga Vertov, 1926.
Vertov felt that the camera was honest in a way that the human eye never could be. The camera simply recorded. It did not opine. It only took what it saw. Now there is so much that can be seen. Jeremy Bentham was a lawyer and a philosopher, an interesting combination, to say the least. His views on law are still influential today. His primary contribution to surveillance was the idea of the panopticon, an inspection house where the inspector could observe every action of every inmate at any time. Bentham intended this design model to be the basis of jails, hospitals, asylums, anywhere it would be advantageous for the authority to know what was happening.
It is obvious that, in all these instances, the more constantly the persons to be inspected are under the eyes of the persons who should inspect them, the more perfectly will the purpose X of the establishment have been attained. Ideal perfection, if that were the object, would require that each person should actually be in that predicament during every instant of time. This being impossible, the next thing to be wished for is that, at every instant, seeing reason to believe as much, and not being able to satisfy himself to the contrary, he should conceive himself to be so. Jeremy Bentham, 1791.
In his landmark work, Discipline and Punishment, French philosopher Michel Foucault revived the idea of the panopticon and invigorated it with modern sensibilities. Foucault argued that the knowledge or the fear of surveillance can be instrumental in shaping behavior. He called this phenomenon internalization.
He who is subjected to a field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes the principle of his own subjection. Michel Foucault, 1995.
So, what is the truth? Is the camera innocent, culpable, a tool of our oppression, or something else entirely?
Hello, I'm Dawn Schrader. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. I have an interest in the psychology of privacy and privacy awareness. Fundamentally, we have been exploring ideas about what it is that people consider to be personal information, the value that they have on that personal information, and the kinds of risks and benefits that they see for the use of technology in their everyday life and the impact of that on society and democracy. So I've been continually astonished with the way that technology develops over time, and that is, just even thinking about a situation like this, when we have this camera that is so compact and we can move in a lot of different places, it's great. Because it used to be that we'd have these giant pieces of equipment sitting on our shoulders, and so getting information, gathering information was so much more difficult than it is now, where we can use iPad cameras, or we can use telephone, cell phone cameras to capture information and convey it to a lot of people very quickly. The whole panopticon thing was so interesting to me when I first started learning about that. Yeah. It was one of the things that shaped the way that I think about privacy and surveillance. And I started thinking about, okay, how is it that we're really turning into this surveillance society? I think it has a different sense or a different flavor of how we're making sense out of our world when we're looking at every single thing that we're encountering in a way that could be possibly recorded, and not just recorded but shared very, very broadly. And also the idea of control. Who has control over how that information is shared? So what information do you want to keep in what context, and hold that there? And I think that when it comes to cameras and surveillance on CCTV, things like that, first of all, we don't even know, we're not even aware of how much information is being collected about us on an everyday basis. And then secondly, we don't know where that information is going. So it's really hard to divorce ourselves from this idea that we are living these private information, we have private information, or that we are keeping things private when we are also embracing this all these technological advances that come with phones and iPads.
Can you maybe explain your proposal for the tripartite model of privacy?
Okay.
How easy will it be to implement that model?
Okay, it's a good question, and I'm glad you're asking it, because coming up with the notion of tripartite scares people a little bit. So when I wrote the paper originally and submitted it, I was really surprised to get some of the feedback on it saying, what do you mean tripartite? Doesn't that sound a little religious, having this notion of the three, it's basically just a 3-component model, and we had to go tripartite or triune or whatever. The language conveys so much of meaning because it connects with people's experiences in the past, and so we've had to really struggle with that. So first of all, I'm not totally thrilled by calling it a tripartite model, except that it has 3 parts. Okay, so essentially the first part is awareness. So because of my interest overall in epistemology, how people make sense out of knowledge and information, awareness seemed to me one of the fundamental aspects of how it is that we think about privacy and private information. So, so the awareness part is, are we aware, first of all, that we think something's private, and second of all, what to do with that information? So awareness is an important part. Secondly, what do you do with that awareness once you have it? Are you going to be able to translate that into action of some kind? So action is the second part of that model. And action can be anywhere from saying, okay, I'm aware, I acknowledge, and I decided I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to change my privacy settings. Like, I'm not going to have a longer password. I'm not going to do anything to change this. All the way to thinking that, well, it's futile. I might as well not even engage in any action. That's still an action as well. So we have to think about those kinds of things. And then the last part is judgment. So making kinds of judgments or some sort of cognitive decision making involved there. And so I think we have to make our judgments based upon our awareness, like this sense of awareness of what was happening, and we make our judgments based upon our past experiences and action. So I really see that these 3 components, the awareness and the judgment and the action, are completely dynamically in movement all the time with one another. And it is essentially those 3 components that I think guide all of our human psychology.
Hi, my name is Brett Stoll. I'm a second-year PhD student at Cornell University. I'm in the communication department, and I work in Dr. Susan Fussel's intercultural communication lab. In this lab, we work with telepresence robots and trying to understand how these telepresence robots afford certain group dynamic shifts and how that influences how groups interact with each other. So currently what we're looking at is if you introduce a telepresence robot into a team setting where they're trying to complete a task, what sort of influence do we see from these telepresence robots on how people perceive and interact with each other and ultimately complete the task successfully together?
So Brett, could you broadly define what telepresence is?
Broadly define telepresence. Well, so telepresence has been been around for a number of years. Like, so telepresence robots is not the only place that we use this type of technology, but broadly speaking, telepresence is any kind of projection of oneself through some sort of mediated technology to a remote location. So somewhat, I guess remote could be as remote as the distance from me to here. Obviously I'm being telerepresented through this device, but something like Skype is just as much telepresence as this is.
Can you ask him about some other forms of telepresence?
So yeah, could you maybe mention some other forms of telepresence?
Some other forms of telepresence might include something where you aren't exactly embodied or visually embodied in a device, but I mean something like texting, in a sense, you could consider telepresence. You're being represented remotely by some other form, or if you consider what avatars are in any kind of gaming app that you use or social application that you have, in a sense, that's all really a kind of telepresence, where you're being projected onto something or mediated through technology in some form that's not your own.
How far back in history can we go in terms of like humanity's like first interaction with telepresence?
I'm not sure that I know the answer to that exactly. Like, historically, I don't know when exactly we started seeing some of this technology come forward, but I would certainly assume, with the introduction of computers, I think there's been a desire to try to have that kind of projection, and we've gotten more sophisticated with it over time. But certainly, I don't know what exactly the first categorization of that would be. Yeah, so the beam robots, these came out, I don't know exactly how long ago this was, but they're manufactured by Suitable Technologies. I believe they're located in Palo Alto, California. But these originally came out, not in this form, but this is called the Beam Plus robot. But there's also a Beam Pro robot, which was their first iteration design of this. This is much more of a consumer model. The Beam Pro is actually a much larger, I'd say it's probably about twice the size of this. It has technically better audio and visual capabilities. But the catch with that is, with better affordances and capabilities, the cost goes up.
Okay.
So with those are typically ranged somewhere between $18,000 and $20,000. But with these, I guess you call them more consumer-friendly models, you're looking at about $2,000 for these. Okay. So the comparison is pretty drastic, really, in terms of cost, and in some cases, capabilities. Although sometimes I wonder if you can really justify the, what is it now, $16,000 to $18,000 difference. But as a business, they've been pretty successful and pretty interesting to look at in terms of what they've been able to do in terms of getting these out there and marketing them towards events. Because if you think of how the average person would use this, I think sometimes it's difficult to think of like, okay, telepresence robotics, it's cool, it's an interesting idea, but practically, where's the use for me? And so what we've seen is, from at least their perspective, they've marketed this in a number of different ways. So predominantly with the Beam Pros, those have been geared toward more of a professional setting. So in terms of having them in workplaces, taking them to professional events and conferences, and actually being able to engage remotely in that sense. This consumer model, I think they envision is much more as a in the home, and maybe some workplaces, but something, let's say for example, for grandparents to visit around home, or to do check-ins where if distance is a big enough factor where you can't travel, you always have this option instead.
Okay. So why is that, like, telepresence is more prevalent in terms of being more popular in software, and it's personally my first time seeing one of these devices. I've never really come across telepresence on wheels, for instance. Why is that?
I think a lot of it comes down to ability and sophistication of the technology. And I think it took people a while to get to the point where they had something that they could manufacture that was affordable, and that people would actually be drawn to want to use. So these have actually been around. This idea of mobile telepresence technology has been around probably somewhere between 15 and 20 years. of trying to get something that makes sense, that's usable, and that can be manufactured in a way that you can distribute it widely. So these have been around, but they've been tucked away and hidden in labs, and manufacturers trying to come up with novel ways to produce these in meaningful and useful ways. Okay, so let me kind of give you a sense of how this works. It's actually surprisingly intuitive and really easy to get going. So the controls on here are really nice compared to some of the tools that I've used, in that you can just use, so if you do any type of gaming at all, or if you've ever played even like those small little internet games, all the movement's done through these arrow keys here, forward, back, side to side. Okay. And it's extremely responsive, so as soon as you let up on a key, it stops whatever it's doing there, and there's not really, as far as we've noticed so far, unless you hit a bad Wi-Fi spot, there's not too bad a lag. And if you do happen to run anything, don't worry. Lots of people have, and we haven't broken these yet, so it should be good.
Do you have insurance on this?
I don't think we do. That's a good question. Maybe we should consider that.
Yeah, so all I'm doing is focusing on the bottom camera. That's what I should be doing, right?
Yeah, I think that's usually when it's most helpful, is to focus on that bottom camera.
Okay. All right, now maybe I want to increase the speed a bit. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, it's for someone who has a video gaming experience, it's intuitive. Right?
Yeah, it's pretty nice.
So I'm kind of comfortable with telepresence devices and the beam in general because I feel like I'm someone from a technological background. But is it possible that someone from a non-tech background might be uncomfortable with the device in any way?
Yeah, I definitely think so. To consider what these are in relation to, I don't know, the narrative of robots, I think. With people who have never interacted with these before, they have maybe an idea of what a robot is and what it can do, but they don't necessarily have the answer. So you've got all kinds of movies, books, whatever it might be, news stories that talk about robots. But when you actually see one in practice, and you have to ask yourself, okay, first off, what is it? Who's behind it? What are its capabilities? And if you can't answer those questions, I think it can be unsettling, because you don't know what exactly that interaction is going to be like, or really what that person behind it intends to do with it.
So, Brett, you talk about how this is a robot of sorts, but one can argue that it's just a mobile camera on wheels. So, like, how do you justify that?
For sure, yeah. I think the traditional conception of what a robot is you think of like this big bulky metal machine that operates on its own and has a face-like feature that's not ours, right? It's something else. But really, there's variations of what is technically a robot and what concerns it. So it's really all how we define it. Okay. As far as this goes, technically I would argue this is a robot in the sense that it is a machine that is something that can interact and move around the environment. So in that sense, I do consider it robotic or a robot in nature. But I can understand exactly why you would question, this is a lot like an iPad on a stick, right? It's tough to make that justification. And on top of that, you have the sense that this is a telepresence device. So what you have is people being projected onto this device rather than it functioning autonomously, which I think is how we traditionally conceptualize robots as well.
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's really all on how you define it, right?
What are some of the like privacy issues that arise from these sort of robots? You know, like, do people look at it as something that would invade their privacy in any way?
That's a good question. I don't know that we haven't seen those concerns yet, working strictly in a lab format, but I could certainly think of how people would consider potential privacy violations. One thing to consider is that this whole interface runs on your computer, so basically anything you can do on your computer in terms of screen recording or the like can be done through this telepresence robot as well. So in a sense, let's say you're comparing it to somebody walking around the street with a camcorder, it's very easy to identify that that person has a recording device, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of the ability to identify whether they're recording, whether the red light's on or whatever it is, that's pretty easy. With these, you kind of have to go on faith with the person, right? Because as we were running earlier, we were running a screen capture program on the computer to capture the interface so that you have that type of footage.
Yeah.
I can just as easily run that in an interaction with another person and be recording our entire conversation without any indication to the other person as to what I'm doing on my end.
Okay.
So for sure, yeah.
Yeah. And like in a group setting, like you mentioned some of your research is about like seeing how the beam performs in a team dynamic or something. So do people behave and act differently in the presence of the beam?
Not inherently as far as I've seen. So I don't see them behaving differently because they have different conceptions in terms of what it's being used for.
Okay.
I think they tend to adhere to whatever the context is that they're in. I think, though, if you were to prompt them with an understanding of the capabilities of what that person can do, so if you were to prompt them with this idea, and just so you know, they do have the capability of recording anything that's said, I think then you might see people interacting much differently.
Okay.
Hi, I am Rohit Prakash. I am currently a master's student in the Department of Information Science at Cornell. I come from a small place called Chandigarh, which is in the state of Punjab in India. I have an extensive experience of 8 years in the field of information science and technology. Before joining Cornell, I was with a company called Grofers, which is India's largest hyperlocal company. My job there was to build a highly scalable system which powers their retail and their last mile logistics. I started my career as a software developer in a firm called Clickable, where I built some analytic solutions and went up all up to the way of becoming a CTO of a company. So I appreciate technology at various levels, and I'm keen to learn various new and upcoming technologies.
So Rohit, tell us about video surveillance in India and how it's different from what it is in America.
I think that things like surveillance, it's still in an infancy as far as India is concerned, and I'm only talking about what I have seen.
Mm-hmm.
Things could be different in actuality. My only personal experience with video surveillance is what happens in the company. So all the companies do have these video camera installed, and they keep on recording various things. I distinctly recall in my last company what happened was that one of my chargers got stolen, and this Apple charger is actually an expensive piece of equipment, especially in India. And when I went to the security people to just have a scan of who actually stole it from my desk, and I just figured out that even the system wasn't working. No one is actually concerned about these things. They don't take it seriously. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right, cool. So like, do you think people are bothered that they're tracked in India at all? Like, how is it different? Like, are people concerned about their rights for privacy?
So I think let's just look at the demographics here.
Mm-hmm.
Majority of people still belong to a rural milieu in a way,
Yeah.
and I hardly think they care about these things. I mean, they want to get their daily wages, earn a living, have some food at the end of the day. this is really not of their concern at all. That's what I feel. But in the cities, there would be certain places where people do feel that their privacy is being obstructed. But I haven't seen a case personally where people are actually concerned with someone videotaping them or something like this.
Rohit, like you've lived in India most of your life, and now you're here in America. So, could you tell us how video surveillance and privacy in general is like looked at differently in India than it is in America?
Yes, I feel that it's a, it's mainly a first world problem. If you look at surveillance and privacy, I don't think people in India are concerned about these things. I mean, there are bigger things to be concerned about rather than privacy and surveillance. People do not have food to eat, and in my opinion, majority of people in India are rural people. So I don't think they don't even have these mobile phones that we have here. They are so away from technology. So I don't think they.
But India still does have like one of the largest urban population in the world. So what do you think people in the urban locations think about privacy, and is it looked at a similar light as it is in America? I mean, are people a bit less concerned about their right to privacy back in India, like talking about the urban regions?
I think urban regions, yes, people do have access to technology and every other new things that are coming up. But again, as I said, I don't think that people are concerned about privacy and surveillance there. Yeah. So another reason why I think privacy is not a concern in India is that if you look at it historically, I mean, we used to live in small houses. We share a same space with, I mean, having your own room, and I'm talking about 1980s, having your own room was like a luxury. I mean, my parents are here, my sister is here, we're all studying in the same place, someone is cooking, and it was true for majority of India, even now. So, a person since birth doesn't have a concept of privacy in a way.
I think that's really interesting, like, that you mentioned lifestyle as a
Lifestyle, precisely.
factor. Like,
So,
you mentioned
I
economy
mean,
before.
everyone is constantly watching you there, like the concept of joint families, because so there's no concept of privacy as such, and people are born and bred in this environment, and when they come out, I don't think the same thing follows through. So they hardly concerned. So majority of government things which the government install are always in a state of you can't be sure whether it's working or not. For example, the traffic lights, half of the time they are not working, so you cannot be sure whether this camera is working or not.
So the decoy effect of the camera is not prevalent in India, like in the sense that, like, even if a camera is not working in America, just the fact that, you know, it may or may not be working, like, scares people in America and prevents them from committing crime.
I guess that's true because in America that's true because in the past they have learned that things are typically working, and there have been consequences because they have the camera has captured something which it shouldn't have captured. But in India, the very tenet that it's working, it has not been established so far. I mean, I haven't seen any case where this has been clearly established. So one of the problems that we just touched upon is that there are not enough people to monitor through all the fields that are coming through the camera. So what if we could automate it? Up till few years back, this technology wasn't available, but nowadays people are coming up with what's known as deep neural nets to mimic what a human being would act like. So we see this technology already in place for self-driving cars, and I think with enough training and data set, we could actually teach a computer to distinguish between something which shouldn't happen with something that it should easily ignore. So I think a case like the rape case that happened in the bus could have been picked up by a computer, and they could have alerted the authorities there and then, and this could have been prevented. I think that in the near future, this is something which will happen for sure.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, that would give the camera so much power that it would equal the human eye.
Yeah, I think so. That is the place we are actually headed towards.
Not surprisingly, the case of the camera is far from resolved. While I think Veritov is right that this technology is impartial, it is the use of the technology that is of concern. Can privacy survive in an increasingly visible world? Only time will tell. After talking to our experts, Billy and I set out in search of cameras here at Cornell.
Okay, so there's that.
Let's get the sign.
We'll get this sign too. Oh yeah, this is a good sign. What did we do?
Well, that camera is my dispatch, and they saw you out here taking pictures of the camera. So now they want to know why you're out here.
Be extremely subtle, even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious, even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate. Sun Tzu, The Art of War.
Oh, that's a perfect shot.